Welcome everyone to Economics Matters. Today we're joined by Camilla Cavendish and of course my father and host of the show, Larry Kotlikoff, professor of economics at Boston University. I just wanted to give a little bio for our guest today, Camilla. Camilla Cavendish, who's actually also known as the Baroness of Cavendish of Little Venice, is an award-winning journalist and broadcaster and the author of Extra Time, 10 Lessons for an Aging World, published by HarperCollins in 2019. She's a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, and a contributing editor at the Financial Times, where she writes a weekly op-ed column on Saturdays. Camilla's career has spanned both the private and public sectors. She was head of the Prime Minister's Downing Street Policy Unit under David Cameron, and previously a non-executive director of the Care Quality Commission, the National NHS, and Care Regulator. In 2020, Camilla became a temporary advisor to the Secretary of State for Health during the COVID-19 pandemic, and authored a set of recommendations into the reform of health and social care. She sits in the House of Lords as a crossbench peer, and until 2022, was chair of the nonprofit Frontline, which puts talented graduates into social work. Camilla started her career at McKensie Co. and also worked for the CEO of Pearson PLC, which I'm sure she'll tell us more about. And she's currently a strategy advisor to a number of companies. And I should say that she holds a degree from Oxford and Harvard. So I think that's a pretty good bio from my end, but we're going to have you expound upon that because we know that you have a pretty illustrious career, and I want to hear more about your book. But before we go there, I'll hand it over to Larry.
Yeah, so Camilla, it's great to have you. Really pleasure. So Camilla spans, as Alex was indicating, just a range of different activities and interests and endeavors, public policy, public initiatives for the and if you look at the Wikipedia entry on Camilla, it goes on a lot longer than that brief bio. It says that she's like the fourth most influential female in the UK. I think it says that. I think that means you're maybe up there with Meghan Markle. I don't know.
I think that was a few years ago. I'm not competing now.
Okay. And she's worked, I mean, the range of things she's done, like, for example, putting on a sugar tax on soft drinks, which we know leads to obesity. We certainly don't have that kind of sensible policy in the US, even though our obesity problem is far worse than that in the UK, I believe. She worked on developing the South Bank of the Thames. So really instrumental in improving London, which is my favorite city in the world. She's worked at the Sunday Times. I mean, it's really worth going and checking her out on Wikipedia. But Camilla, what I'd like to do is kind of start out the way we've done with other guests, which is and we will get to your interesting book, not just interesting, really fabulous book called Extra Time. Let me just, before I turn this over to you, just say what Larry Summers, the former Secretary of Treasury, said about your book. He said it's demographic, he says demographic change is the most important shaper of our future. And of course, Extra Time is about the aging of society and how we're going to adjust to that appropriately, personally, and collectively. But anyway, demographic change is the most neglected shaper of our future. Camilla Cavendish has written the most interesting, perspective, and iconoclastic guide to its many implications. This is a truly important book. That's Larry Summers, Lawrence Summers, President Emeritus, and Charles W. Elliott, University Professor of Harvard University and former Secretary of Treasury.
And your former roommate, is that not correct?
Former co-author.
Former co-op.
Co-author, yeah. But so Camilla, tell us, where all this started, where you grew up, where you went to, school, you went to Oxford. Tell us a little bit about your kind of path, your career path, how you
Okay.
ended up with these different jobs, and then we'll go from there.
I don't have a career path, Larry. I have a CV that headhunters wince at when they see it because it makes no sense whatever. And if I ever get to give one of those talks to, younger people, I try to encourage them by saying, you really can just try and follow a wiggly path and do things you think are interesting at the time, which is what I've been lucky enough to do with my life. I grew up in South London. My parents were both intellectuals, basically. They had not very much money, but a lot of books, and they both worked writing from home throughout my childhood. And all their friends were artists or musicians, and I had no idea what an office was or what business was at all. And I went to Oxford. I read PPE, which, we're now told that the whole of the UK political elite has been crippled by the fact that everyone read PPE and it's far too narrow. There's quite a lot in that. And I got a scholarship to the Harvard Kennedy School where I did my MPA. So, you could say I've always been a bit of a public policy wonk. That's sort of really who I am.
I was reading
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Alex. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, I just wanted to just briefly. I know this is a little tangential, but I was reading that your father seemed to be a very interesting historian. My
father actually. In the US, they're just about to launch the 50th anniversary edition of his most successful book, which was called The Black Arts.
Yes.
And it was about the occult. And my grandfather was a vicar in the Church of England. And my father grew up in a fairly straight-laced household where people believed in God, talked about God, but also were very intellectual and asked questions. So he devoted most of his life to trying to understand why people have believed in different things. So he wrote about comparative religion, he wrote about folklore. I spent a lot of my childhood driving out to fields and standing in front of standing stones and kind of inhaling the spirituality of that. And we had a crystal ball on the mantelpiece. My parents had dinner with people who would draw chalk circles on the floor. My father went to Stonehenge with druids, but he never really believed in any of it. He just had a great liking for all these different kinds of people who were seeking some kind of spirituality. And it was a wonderful childhood in that sense, because he was a deeply, deeply compassionate and humane man. And it just so happened that his best-selling book was about the Black Arts, which made him unusual.
That is, yeah.
Was he a consultant for Harry Potter?
Was he a what for Harry Potter?
Consultant to the Harry Potter series? No,
not at all. Sadly not.
Sadly not.
He never made any money out of it. He was never interested in money at all, which upset my mother. He was deeply interested in intellectual pursuits. I was once locked out of his study because I was found in his study at quite a young age reading out spells from a book. And I think that's where I learned my healthy respect for this. My father he was agnostic about many of these things, but he had a certain feeling that you didn't want to call on forces beyond your power. And I suppose I've inherited a bit of that.
Wow, that's very interesting. That's a little spooky, a little very interesting. But so shall we start? Let's talk about kind of what you're up to now and what in 2019 you wrote your book, Extra Time. Let's maybe talk about the present, but then let's go back to 2019, talk about the book a bit, and then we'll start talking about you're writing for the Financial Times right now, a weekly column. So you're covering, I imagine, everything. And we have everything going on in the world. And, you say you're not an economist, but you're going to National Bureau of Economic Research seminars or and meetings.
Look, I've been so lucky in my life that I've been able to sit in a whole range of rooms I never dreamed I would sit in. I've been in the editorial conferences of newspapers. I've been in the office of the Prime Minister. I've been in academic conferences up the road from you, Larry. And I've just reveled in all of it, really. But I'm a jack of all trades. I'm an absolute expert at none. What I do now is I have this wonderful platform in the FT where I can range quite widely, really, from domestic policy through more global issues. And I write quite a lot about society. I've done a lot of work. I did a big campaign many years ago where I succeeded in convincing the government to open up the family courts to the press because there were a lot of miscarriages of justice going on. I'm sort of really interested in a whole series of social issues, health as being one of them. But what I'm doing now at Harvard is looking at demographics and specifically this plummeting birth rate, which we're seeing in almost every continent outside Africa. And I'm looking at the implications of that, along with a lot of other wonderful people, because this is coming much faster than anybody anticipated. If you look at Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, those countries, I mean, they have very high marriage rates and astonishingly low fertility. And all of these countries are having to grapple with what on earth that means for their tax system, for the social contract between generations. If we're running out of babies, who's going to take care of us? There was a whole series of fascinating issues there.
Go, Alex. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I haven't read the book, and I'm planning on doing so because it just seems fascinating, and I'm interested in all these questions as well. I imagine that there's a range of factors that you've identified as to why birth rates are plummeting. Maybe you want to just talk about what some of those factors are, and I imagine there's differences between continents and different countries too.
There are, but not as. The thing that's really striking is the uniformity of this trend. I mean, there's very few things in the world which, when you plot them on a graph, are quite as uniform as this, in the sense that the gradient is the same. So, we all know China had a one-child policy.
Right.
But the truth is that many other countries, including India, didn't have a one-child policy, and they're on the same trajectory ultimately. And some of this, I've interviewed women all over the world about this, and a lot of this is a really positive story of female empowerment, women getting careers, throwing off the shackles of the duty to the household, quite a lot of negativity about the mother-in-law. People want to be freed from a lot of this convention, and quite a lot of criticism, as you can imagine, all over the world, from women saying, men are not stepping up, they're not doing the chores, they're not splitting things equally. And quite a lot of evidence in Europe that the countries which we all think of as the ultimate perfection countries, the Scandinavians and so on, where actually men do seem to really be very positive about women's careers, very supportive in the home, they actually are seeing slightly higher birth rates. But there's something else going on, I think, which is not just that. I think people are really concerned about bringing another child into this world. I think if you're in your 20s now, looking at climate change, looking at AI, you've been through the financial, you're suffering quite often the effects of the financial crisis, deep insecurity. These fissures which are running through most of our societies are genuinely making people question, can they afford a child, but also is it the right thing to do? And a lot of people making choices that a child is no longer essential for their status in life, which is also a very positive thing. I mean, I say that having 3 children myself, but I think it's a very positive thing that people feel they have a choice.
Well, I would say that I'm 32. I don't have any children, but I share some of those concerns as well. And that's certainly been a determining factor. But it is interesting when you're talking about, developing or sort of semi-developing countries where, birth rates, expanding birth rates is sort of has economic benefits sometimes for a family too. Right.
Well, this is the whole thing, isn't it? So, if you were one of the Asian tiger countries, the demographic dividend was reaped because they went from a big population to a smaller one where they invested a lot more in the education of each child. And there's a big question about whether some of the sub-Saharan African countries will be able to reap a similar demographic dividend. But there's also the whole geopolitical implication of China having peaked, its working age population has peaked, its total population has peaked, it doesn't want immigrants and it's too big to solve the problem with immigrants, versus America, which has been until recently an exception in the West. It still had quite a high birth rate until recently, much more open to immigrants. Very interesting questions about the balance of power. How much will China be able to afford to keep spending on its military? What's it going to have to do? It doesn't have a welfare state to look after all these old people. I mean, really, really quite important questions, which are often seen as long-term, but are really coming at us quite fast.
And then another dimension I wanted to ask about is sometimes we hear about low virility rates amongst men,
Yeah.
and it seeming to be a problem. Do you address that in the book? And have you thought about?
Oh no, yeah. I mean, I don't go into all of this in the book. This is my current research, and the book has a certain amount of this, but the book is mainly about the challenges of the aging world.
Right.
I mean, you can't look at one without the other. But so the book is very much more a positive prescription. It's a manifesto for how we age better, really. There is a real. You're completely right. I've just started reading about possible virility problems with men, and that is, I'm not quite sure. I don't think it's the whole story by any means, but you're quite right. I mean, almost no attention has been paid to it yet.
Right.
So I was just in in South Korea, in Seoul, to give a talk to the government about their fertility issue, and they've got, I think their fertility rate's now 0.73. It's the lowest in the world. It might be the lowest reported ever. So I think they're projected to go from about 56 million people down to about 12 million by the end of the century. So this is
it's existential for them, isn't it?
Existential. But so the people I found, there was two women that were kind of taking me around, were helping to organize the conference that we were having, and so I got to talk to them in the car. And one gal was about 33, and she was working to get an accounting degree. She was doing this on the side. And I started asking her about whether she was dating anybody. No. What did her mother think? Her mother was really angry with her all the time. Her mother was pushing her. She had made an agreement with her mother to go out on one blind date, but not until she had finished her accounting degree. When would that be? A year or two. Why did she need to finish her accounting degree to go out on the one blind date? Because in order for her to get a matchmaker company to connect her with an appropriate match, she needed to have an accounting degree. She otherwise would not be taken by them. And she came from and then I said, well, do you hang out with guys? Do you go out to bars and weekend? I go out to bars, but would you go to meet men, or you go out with boyfriends or whatever? No, I go out with a bunch of girlfriends. And do you interact with the guys at the bar? No, we're not really interested in them. I got the sense that maybe what was going on here is that young women just don't like young men in Korea. And
there's a word in Japan that women have for men, which is herbivore men, which is a very disparaging term for men that they don't really think measure up. They think they're weak, they're not pulling their weight. It is a very interesting trend. So forceful women are getting fed up with men. And by the way, I mean, in Japan, I went to, there are marriage bureaus. The men are going with their own mothers at the age of 40, 45. The mother is taking them to the marriage bureau, which kind of says it all about family life, doesn't it?
Oh my gosh.
That's what women are reacting against.
And are the younger men getting upset about this, or what is? Are they changing?
They are. I mean, it's an interesting passivity in Italy. Italy, of course, is famously the great Catholic country in Europe, the country of love and amore, and it has an unbelievably low birth rate. And if you look at the stats, you find men are living at home into their 30s, being looked after by mother-in-law, and partly because they can't make enough money because of the crushing effects of the financial crisis, and women are tending to leave home, and they are very disparaging about the men because they're saying they're not breadwinners, and also they're not prepared to muck in and look after the kids. So why would I have one?
Is it, it's interesting. There's similar parallels, I think, even in the U.S., at least amongst certain classes in the U.S., where women seem to be excelling by some measures, probably more than men on average. That's what I've heard, at least.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Go ahead.
Well, there's also a group of high earning women now who are breaking the link in America. So they're actually having slightly more children. Very highly educated women are sort of now, I think, beginning to feel, okay, maybe I can have it all. If you've got enough money, they can get the childcare in place. And there's a certain amount more positive kind of bargaining going on with their employer. So that is a change in the trend. The other place is Israel. Israel is bucking every trend. I mean, the fertility rate there is 3.2, religious and secular. I mean, it's phenomenal. Yep. Yeah, and they use IVF very widely. But I mean, I think it's, they're all in maybe a siege mentality. But I mean, it does show that there are some exceptions.
What do you think about also, I've read about at least in the United States, like just the decline in people having sex generally.
That's actually, I know, it's not borne out by the evidence. I've looked at this. It's also, I think a lot of this, remember, is self-reported surveys. I mean, it's a bit difficult. What are you going to ask if you're 16 and someone's standing over you at school saying, "Do you have sex?" Are you going to say yes or no? What are you going to? I mean,
right.
I think these are a little tricky. I wouldn't quite believe all of that.
Right.
But do you think video games or distractions in this area are reducing the interaction between sexes? And do you think
all of this is possible, but I think what we're actually seeing is deliberate choices being made by people who often are in relationships, not to have kids. And the problem is, coming on to the older people. I mean, your mother, your South Korean mother, in your example, probably wants to become a grandmother. Grandparents are actually playing an enormously important role, much more than they used to, in people's lives, because they are living longer. And they are really, a lot of them, very healthy and very energetic into their 70s. So if they do manage to get the grandchild, they're likely to be much more involved and actually provide a lot of the support, which is the irony of the whole thing, really.
So this brings us to maybe coming to your book about extra time, because you're talking about being productive at this, basically the second stage of your life. Not thinking of this as retiring, but just changing what your focus is, what you're doing. So maybe take us through the book a bit.
So the reason I wrote the book was actually because of my father, who we talked about earlier. So I've always said I would never write a book because I grew up with two writers watching them type away on those old-fashioned typewriters and basically getting done over by the publisher. And I just thought, well, this is really hard work. When my father died, I was very, very close to him, and I thought a lot about how his world had shrunk. He suffered acutely from depression in later life. He was incredibly physically healthy, but he sort of began to feel old at 50. And when my mother left him, which was when he was about 50, they argued over the two cats. That was the biggest issue in the divorce, was our two cats, and my mother got the cats. And so I kept saying to my father, well, get some more cats. You love cats. You're on your own. He never got a cat because he kept thinking, well, my life might end. I don't know how much longer I've got. And I can't risk having a cat and leaving it homeless. And the cats, he lived for 36 more years till he was 86. And he never had a cat who could have kept him company. And I sort of reflected on that and thought, there's something tragic about the narrowing of our lives and our expectations of what old age is, because he was not old in any sense until he was about 80 and then got depression. And I then went to Japan, where I found that they're not interested in you until you're at least 75. Geriatricians just are not interested, because until then you're what they call young old. The Japanese are pretty healthy. They don't suffer from the obesity problems that we have. They focus a lot on diet and walking and exercise, and also on purpose. And having a sense of purpose in later life is hugely correlated with health. Feeling needed, feeling you've got a reason to get up in the morning. You might be looking after your grandchildren. You might still be running a hedge fund. Those things are hugely correlated with your healthy outcomes. And then I started going to other countries and meeting all these people who are redefining what age means. Which was incredibly inspiring. So having set out to write quite a pessimistic, gloomy book, I then thought, wait a minute, this is silly. These people are in extra time, which is, as you know, in football, it's when there's everything left to play for. It's that bit at the end of the game.
Right.
There are athletes, there are masters athletes there was one Japanese athlete who ran the 100 meters in 15 seconds when he was 85. I mean, people are setting new records all the time, and they're not as exceptional as we are led to believe. So, every time you think of Joe Biden, or you think of the Queen, or you think, oh, these people are exceptions. Actually, increasingly they're not. And there are two groups of people. There are highly energetic, healthy people who've often retired too early, who get really bored and need to get back in. There is another group, unfortunately, who do suffer from multiple chronic illnesses and are old far too early in their life. And that's partly due to diet, it's partly due to poverty, which we also in the US and UK really need to address.
What about the apologies for using a millennial term, but what about at least this is something that I think is a phenomenon in the US. I don't know if you agree, but there is this kind of ageism
absolutely
that we see, and a kind of bias towards older people, or even people, like you say, if they hit 40 or 50, they're considered to be irrelevant in a sense, but also this is reflected sometimes in the labor market too, where older people maybe they're feeling energetic and they're feeling capable, but they can't actually get a job because an employer believes well, you're just too old.
Yeah, and if you think about it, AARP is a membership organization. You can join it when you're 50, which I have said to them, I don't think that's a great symbol, because no one's old at 50, right?
Right.
I mean, in both the US and UK, it's fascinating. We have tight labor markets. We need more people in work. And yet in both those countries, the over 45s were the main source of growth and employment for the last decade. And then since the pandemic and during the pandemic, they are the ones who've dropped out of the labor force. And there's quite a lot of evidence in both our countries to say those people dropped out because they were pushed out, because younger people thought, great, this is time to get rid of Bob, time to get rid of Andy, and they can't get back in, as you say. Now, some of them are sick, some of them are looking after people who are sick, and some of them have given up looking. They don't even appear in the statistic because they're not officially unemployed, but there's an awful lot of them out there. And I think ageism is rampant. I mean, I think we need to treat it like sexism and racism, but we don't. We don't think about it.
I absolutely think so too. Yeah.
We also have this very pernicious part of our social security system where, let's say you're furloughed at 62, you're forced to take Social Security because you didn't expect to get it, to be furloughed, and then you're told that if you earn beyond basically the minimum wage, you lose 50 cents on the dollar.
Oh,
so
right.
we have this tax, but the pernicious thing here is, well, that's pernicious enough, but it's worse because actually this tax that you pay, the money you lose, you actually get back in the form of higher benefits in this very unknown adjustment. It's called the adjustment of the reduction factor provision that they don't talk about. They send you a letter every year about your cost of living increase. It says, earn beyond this amount between these ages, you're going to lose 50 cents on the dollar. Small print, there says something about some adjustment later. And what you have here is a tax that's not a tax. It's like a pretend tax. It's like a pretend tax. So it's like if I said to you, Camilla, if you earn another penny, you're going to lose every penny you earn. Every penny you earn, you're going to lose all of it. And then 10 years later, I say, oh, by the way, I was just kidding. Here's the money back that you lost. That took away.
We have
well, if you did work, I give it back to you. As I was kidding. If you didn't work, I just don't even come back to you. I said, that's that. You just didn't work. But you can see that that's affecting tens of millions of people in our country for no good. It's completely crazy policy.
I anticipate a Larry Kotlikoff economics paper on this. Sounds like you're just about to publish a paper on that.
It is an issue. But let's talk a bit about, we've got Ukraine starting its counteroffensive pretty much today, we think. There's a big dam at the Dnipro River that was blown up by the Russians this morning.
Yeah.
How do you view what's happening there, and where do you see things ending up?
So, I mean, our information today is that it is the counteroffensive. I mean, I think the Ukrainians have now said that. Everyone's been, nervous about calling it until they said it. But, and obviously, they have been well supplied by Western powers. They have a couple of months over the summer now to try and regain territory. The Dnipro Dam is a huge story, partly because the nuclear power station that uses that water to cool down could be vulnerable. So I think that from sort of where I'm sitting in the newsroom of the Financial Times, I mean that it could be quite a big story quite soon. I mean, it's been interesting to watch the EU and the US working together on this, and NATO. I think it's been a very, very positive in many ways. I suspect that the big powers regret that they didn't do more to get the global south on board. I think it took a long time for London and Washington to realize that just saying, this is a war for values and we have to stand by Ukraine was not necessarily going to bring on board a whole lot of other countries, which I think the West was too quick to assume they would just leap to the same conclusion. So I think that probably has told us quite a lot about the new world we're in. We are in a multipolar world. We need to kind of, shore up some of those alliances.
And when you say this global south, you're talking maybe about major countries like India or Brazil or.
Yeah, absolutely. Venezuela. I mean, South America. Absolutely. Yes. We can no longer just assume that it's all one block and it's going to swing behind the US.
Right.
I also think there's been an interesting distinction between certainly the position of London versus Paris and Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, London has gone all out in supporting President Zelensky, and officially we have said we believe that total victory means taking back all the territory, which is where Zelensky positioned himself. A lot of diplomats think that may not be realistic, and ultimately he will have to the two sides will eventually become exhausted. Can there be a deal? What are the outlines of that deal going to look like? And I think the White House has clearly been more constrained in terms of defining what it sees as victory.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if this nuclear plant starts, if the fuel rods or whatever start emitting fallout radiation, and that spreads to NATO countries, is this viewed as an attack by Russia on?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, hopefully we won't get there, but I'm just saying, this is war, and collateral damage, comes, and things move very rapidly, and we mustn't forget that.
Do you have any, of course, forecasting the future is impossible, but do you have any sense of a potential peace plan or some kind of negotiation that might occur, or what's sort of your sense?
Well, my sense is, and I'm just going on the judgment of others who know more than me, but my sense is they're nowhere near yet. The two sides have to become a lot more exhausted before anyone's willing to deal. Putin to some extent has painted himself into a corner. He has to have something he can present to the Russian people. Henry Kissinger's, talked a lot about this. It is about how do you construct some form of deal where everyone can save face. I mean, this problem for the Ukrainians is obviously they see this as an existential threat. They believe that unless Russia is pushed back to, its the previous borders, it's going to remain a threat forever, and that is very understandable that they feel like that. Now, the Chinese, as we know, have just stood on the sidelines so far.
Does that include Crimea as well?
Yeah. Well, that's the big issue, isn't it?
Right.
Very, very difficult.
That you've interacted with who've met Putin directly, do they think we're dealing with somebody who's grounded or completely nuts?
I don't think anybody uses the term nuts in those sorts of. I think there is a sense in some circles that his replacement might be worse were he to disappear from the scene. if you look back through his speeches, you can see a certain logic in the way he's constructed this. And the West essentially turned a blind eye to what happened in Crimea. There's a long narrative of Russian victimization and belief that these are territories that belong to them, entirely wrongly in my view, but you can see how he's constructed the argument. One of the things we don't know enough about is how much the Russian people are prepared to withstand. How many casualties are they prepared to see on their side? How many young men are they going to be willing to sacrifice to this? But clearly the propaganda machine is pretty effective in Russia. People there still seem to believe that they are on the right side. It's mystifying to the rest of us, but they unfortunately do.
And it seems like that he's also solidified his control and power over the country. Do you think that it's possible that he might even try to mobilize the country even more?
I don't think he's got much to mobilize with. I think what we've seen is that the Russian army was not well prepared, that they've already run through quite a lot of troops, and equipment. So I'm not sure how much more he's got. They can last a long time, but I'm not sure there's there's not a sort of easy lever to pull in anything.
Right.
The one thing that we do know, of course, is that the sanctions haven't really worked, and that unfortunately, they're managing to get their oil out through all sorts of other means.
Right.
So the Europeans are suffering a huge cost of energy crisis, while Russia is not suffering as much from the economic sanctions as has been hoped.
And it seems to me that one major cost of this war has been the difficulty of the world to adjust to a low carbon future. It seems like it's pushing the climate agenda.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I worry that, there are real issues there, genuine issues. And some countries in Europe have been very swift, very sensible to actually say to their people and their businesses, look, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to take certain measures. You're going to have to turn down your air conditioning. You're going to have to turn the lights off. London, to my dismay, has done none of that. The British have absolutely refused to ask the public to do anything. France and Spain have done quite a lot. But I was worried at the most recent G7 summit that both Japan and Germany were really backsliding on the decarbonisation commitments. And to be honest, if two countries as big as that are saying we can't fulfill our decarbonisation commitments, and you can understand that this situation has created friction, but it's going to be really hard to get the rest of the world on board.
Right, absolutely.
How do you see China's behavior with respect to the whole Russian-Ukraine situation, but just more generally with Taiwan? Is this you think they, let's say if there is some kind of obviously if the Ukrainians push the Russians out, that might be one lesson for Xi. If they don't, it might be a different. Where do you?
Well, I think we worry over here in London, we worry about the rhetoric that is coming out of both Beijing and Washington, and we worry that it's too warlike. And I have to say, there is an awful lot of, when you're in Washington, you're talking to those people, China, making an enemy of China and talking about national security has had a huge number of political benefits, right? It's one of the only things that both of your political parties can agree on. And it's the only reason that Biden got the Inflation Reduction Act through. So you can see the political attractiveness of it. But I do think people, diplomats and people who watch this stuff are concerned that we don't end up with a war by default because each side appears to be escalating its rhetoric against the other. And I think in the last couple of weeks, we have seen a toning down, but we don't want to sleepwalk into an unnecessary war. I don't think anybody wants that.
What about some of the economic actions that Washington has taken towards Beijing? Telling companies that they can't actually, export their goods. Major companies like Samsung, for example, or
Yeah.
much of industry in the Netherlands, for example.
Products with chips. Products with chips.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
I mean,
technology.
because China is such a massive market, and so we have independent companies that Washington's telling, no, you can't do business with China. You have to give up your consumer base. I mean, is this in any way rational or understandable?
Well, you guys are, one of you guys, the Economist, you can tell me. I mean, look, I think it is understandable in the sense that I think there are several things going on. I mean, since Xi came to power, Western companies that I've talked to have become increasingly concerned about their IP, about what China's views really were, and about whether they could continue to function in that market or not. So I don't think this is just purely coming from the White House. And the chips, there are areas where the West is at a disadvantage, and China is building, very effectively, hoovering up some raw materials. I mean, critical minerals is one of the other ones, and this is a game. This is a game that's I think probably quite important to play if we want to preserve our own democratic values. I mean, under the Xi regime, I think we're seeing crackdowns on all sorts of things that we weren't seeing before him. So I mean, nobody kind of knows how long he's going to last. But I accept it's a very strange and uncomfortable time. And by the way, it's also putting enormous pressure on Europe because, of course, by running into the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, what America is doing is hoovering up manufacturing to itself. And it's prompting Europe to have to think very deeply about what our response is going to be, because otherwise we stand to lose. And we see ourselves, most of our countries see ourselves as allies of the US. But if the US isn't careful, it's going to create enormous resentment among its own allies because it's not blundered, but it's clumped pretty heavily into a space where it now recognizes it has to carve out some benefits for Europe and its allies too.
And I assume that part of what you're saying there also is that because of these policies, that one of the threats to Europe is sort of a kind of deindustrialization.
Absolutely, and we're seeing it already. I mean, any company, any multinational company right now is looking at its supply chain. It's thinking, am I going to diversify away from China? If so, where am I going to diversify to? It's also thinking, where am I going to put my headquarters? The momentum to sort of buy American and build American is what Biden's created, which is going to be a bonanza for America. And by the way, in terms of climate change, I'm very positive. I think it is vital to do some of these tax breaks and subsidies to get the green revolution going. But I think there needs to be a more concerted effort made to figure out what are the allies, how are the allies going to participate in that?
So if do you think that through deindustrialization in Europe, and I think what you're suggesting is that there may be more industrialization in the US, maybe I'm misinterpreting what you're saying, but do you think that would be, if that was the case, do you think that would be positive in terms of the fight against climate change and emissions reductions? I mean,
I think that the problem is it's a global problem, right? So, I mean, if one place deindustrializes and all the emissions go somewhere else, it doesn't help. I mean, the West, I think, has been pulling a bit of a stunt for years in the sense that we don't tend to count the emissions that are in all the products that we consume, which are made in China. So, England has quite a good record on carbon emissions, but nevertheless, we're overly smug because we've forgotten that what we're doing is exporting the emissions to factories, a lot of which have until now been in China.
Right.
Now, if those factories move to the US and they become greener, which I think is what you're suggesting, that would be an improvement. But that is going to take some time. Let's just pray it happens, because I sort of worry that in all this other stuff we're still losing sight of the really frightening numbers that are coming out of the IPCC and other reports.
I think, plus the big picture is China is shrinking in terms of population. It's going to be about 400 million smaller, which is bigger than the current US population by the end of the century. based on
Yes.
projections. On the other hand, its labor productivity, if it continues to grow, even a relatively conservative estimate, it'll have about potentially a third of world GDP at the end of the century, just China. And then you add India, you're talking about probably 45%. So
Yes.
we-
Well, this
we
is
have
your
to be-
paper. This is your brilliant analysis that you and I have discussed separately. Yes.
Yeah. So this is like, what simulations taking into account the demographics and fiscal policy and the capital flows and different regions, competition, and aging. And then if you look at how much the US is dependent on China in terms of its, let's say, imports as a share of US GDP and Chinese exports as a share of its GDP, it's not really the case that either, if we had no trade with China, we would, suffer, but not, wouldn't be devastating. China, the same thing. If they stopped trading with the US entirely, even with many other countries, they have such a big market on their own internally to grow. And the idea that the Chinese can't develop chips on their own, it seems quite naive when you see they have all kinds of things they've developed that we don't have here in this country. I've been to factories where they're making like a PET scan and a CAT scan combined as one. We have nothing like that in the US. I've seen with my own eyes that they're doing things that are go beyond. We've done, of course, we don't know everything. Who can tell exactly what the scientific frontiers are in both regions, but we need to come up with an alternative to this. Absolutely, this rhetoric is escalating. It's all confrontation.
Yeah.
The idea that Taiwan, it ultimately will become part of China. We just have to talk about it as a transition and talk about, change the language so that the Chinese know this is going to happen. It's going to happen in time. Let it happen.
I don't. Why are you saying that?
Yeah,
I mean, sorry, Larry. I mean, you've just undermined the will of an entire sovereign nation that does not want to be part of China.
Well,
that was the whole basis for strategic ambiguity from successive US governments for many years. And you're deciding that you disagree with that. I mean, it's fine, but why are you disagreeing with that? I'm intrigued as to why you would suddenly throw that overboard.
Because China is 100 miles away, because they have a navy that's bigger than ours, that they will have, if you just extrapolate the future, China will just dominate the world economy, dominate military power. I do not believe that we will be able to defend Taiwan. We may be able to sink a couple of carriers and call it a day. But if China decides 10 years from now, 15 years from now, when they have 4 times the military that we have, which they could, at least Navy wise, that they want to do a full scale armada, Taiwan will probably surrender, and we will not get involved. That will probably be the outcome. So the question for China really is the cost of that transition. Do they want to have a difficult time between now and when can they come to an agreement with Taiwan where they rent Taiwan or Taiwan rents itself, leases itself for the next 100 years, just like
Hong
Kong.
Mean like Hong Kong? That's a really nice outcome, Larry. Have you been to Hong Kong lately? I mean, do you believe in democracy?
I do. Yes, I do believe in democracy, but I don't believe that China is going to become democratic in the near future.
No, neither do I. But Hong Kong was also on a lease, and it hasn't done terribly well out of that.
Well, there was no way to keep Hong Kong from becoming Chinese forever. It was just not going to happen.
This is really fascinating. So you're saying we should just be fatalistic about Taiwan. We should throw our hands up and say we're not going to support or try and protect a sovereign nation, which is, by the way, very important for our economy. We should just go home now.
Yeah, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that we should lower. You said lower the rhetoric. We should try and think about some other arrangement that involves a gradual transition. We are talking about a one China policy, that we have been pronouncing a one China, using those words. We should try and think about how does that actually come to be through time. We've accepted that for decades in our.
So we talked earlier about Crimea.
Right.
And I was putting the argument to you that one of the reasons Putin felt able to walk into Ukraine, I mean, first of all, he didn't think the Ukrainians would put up such a strong resistance, but he also thought the West would not resist because of what happened in Crimea. You appear to agree with that, but now you're saying that we should let the Chinese walk into Taiwan, apparently not thinking that there would be any further territorial implications?
No, I don't think we should say open door, come on in. If we are going to defend them, we should be explicit and say, if you invade, we will be at war. We should, physical war. You will be shooting against American troops, and submarines will be sinking, and we will be we will be at complete war with you. We should not be making this ambiguous, but we should also be saying, let us come up with a transition plan where one China becomes a reality, and maybe it's going to happen over 50 years, and you're going to have to probably adapt some of your political or rhetoric and your political arrangements to make the Taiwanese comfortable. Let us move together in peace, not along this path, which is going to could be doomsday for both sides.
Okay, well, I personally have a different
we have to
view.
strengthen and weaken our message at the same time, but also be realistic about the long term. The long term is not looking good for the US or the West in confronting China on this. Russia is not China. China is a very, very different animal here.
But I think what you're missing here from my assessment is that while it is true that the Chinese economy, like growth rates and projected growth rates, look astronomical, I don't think that necessarily translates into military power being equivalent to the United States or the Allies at all. I think that the U.S. will continue to dominate militarily, and it's I don't even think it's close in that regard. But I think that the question here to me is that we have a kind of symbiotic economic relationship with China. We have a lot of production in China from multinational companies, a lot of which are predominantly U.S. run. How easy? I mean, it sounds like there's already been some shifting of production away from China, but how much shifting can there be, or like how long is that process? I mean,
shifting will not be, just to be clear, the shifting will be to Vietnam and to Mexico.
Yeah, to Bangladesh.
It won't be to the US. It's not
no,
like
that's shifting. That's right. That's right.
We're not going to reindustrialize at China's expense, or even Europe's expense. That's not in the cards. But militarily, Alex, I think that's not so clear. They have they have a bigger Navy. They will probably have 2 times the size of our Navy in 20 years, 15 years.
The only thing I would say there brings me back to the demographic point. This has not been tested. I wonder whether families which almost all uniformly have one son are going to be willing to sacrifice that son. That has not been tested. If you're actually talking, and I think that's one of the reasons China wants to avoid. There are a whole lot of other wars that can happen. Cyber is one of them, and the Chinese are waging war in all sorts of ways like that. I think they probably are not entirely sure what the outcome of such a war would be. And I think they also probably, hopefully, don't really want it.
I think they also probably don't really want it. And I would say that China, in terms of what it's doing geopolitically, from what I can understand, I think they're doing multiple things, but one of them is that they're building initiatives and coalitions across the world, through their Silk Road initiative, by going into, countries in Africa, Latin America, building political coalitions there. That's a way of,
Yeah.
basically making the world
US,
into a multipolar world.
I think the US should look for ways to cooperate with China on endeavors like investing in Africa. I think we're investing $15 billion in Africa in total in all 49 African countries, which is peanuts. We spend more on Ukraine. So we've kind of basically pulled out of Africa and pulled out of China's taking over in the Middle East in many ways. So we need to figure out how to cooperate and work with them together and change that. I think it's a matter of, this is the only thing we can do is lower the temperature and start talking about other things besides Taiwan, and get them to see.
I agree we need to lower the temperature, but I absolutely do not agree that we need to let China walk into Taiwan. That seems to be a dereliction of most of what we stand for.
Well,
right.
I'm not, let me just for the record say I'm not proposing we let them walk into Taiwan tomorrow. I'm saying that we have expressed a one China policy. What does that mean in practice? You can't expect China to wait for a millennium to have one China. So you have to come up with some formula for them to actually get there and say, okay, we've actually written down a treaty with three parties, the US, Taiwan, and us, and Europe and UK, and everybody agrees this is how it's going to come down. And if it is 100 years, at least the Hong Kong had 100 years of freedom, and that was a plus. Now, obviously, it's a tragedy the way the Chinese are acting, the way they've treated Hong Kong, but it's going to be for China to realize the value of democracy. I think at this point that people don't necessarily value it, or don't. Maybe it's the propaganda, maybe it's I don't know what it is, but
China is an authoritarian regime, Larry, and an enormous holding together an enormous piece of land.
Yeah.
With a multiple of people, some of whom are being locked up in detention centers in order to keep the Communist Party in power. So I think there are a number of reasons why it wouldn't embrace democracy, not least the threat to its own power of its own elite.
Yeah, well, okay. We only have a couple minutes left, but
we'll probably.
Yeah. I think we're going off track a little bit here, but I did want. Last question about China, though, is that you did suggest that large changes have occurred under Xi's control. What are those changes that you see? In terms of...
I think the human rights abuses of the Uyghurs are a real problem. I think some of the crackdowns we've seen on censorship, some of the more increased crackdowns on the press, and also actually some of the interventions into family life, I think have also been quite significant. I mean, clearly it was really, really interesting in the pandemic lockdown. I mean, by the way, to our earlier conversation, China did not succeed in inventing its own COVID vaccine.
That's right.
And his refusal to buy vaccine from the West actually put millions and millions of his own people in jeopardy. And his response to that was to simply lock them up in their houses. And the spontaneous outbursts against that were enough to force the Communist Party to back down, which I thought was really, really significant. And he did change his tune. But I think it shows how difficult it is to hold that society together. And I think some of that immediate response, which is we're going to refuse to buy the Western vaccine, we're just going to try and keep people locked up in their cities, was quite a totalitarian response.
Yeah, and
this is why I think we should be open to the possibility of change in China, that it's not, yes, they're totalitarian, and yes, they are suppressing Uyghurs, and yes, they're doing terrible things in many, many ways. And yes, we've done that in the US too. We've suppressed Native Americans. We've engaged in a Holocaust really with Native Americans over our history, but we have progressed, and China, and Xi does not have absolute power. We saw that with the basically people saying, forget about it, we're walking out the door, and he had to surrender. So things can still change, and we don't want to lock ourselves into a kind of mindless we're heading to war.
I think what you're saying
Absolutely,
that
absolutely.
we don't want to have the rhetoric actually reinforce totalitarian control in China, right? Because when a great power feels very threatened like that, there's a tendency to rally around the leader and a central party. So I mean, that's just one way to think about it. But
Anyway,
yeah.
do you have any final thoughts, Camilla, about all the things we've discussed?
Talk about
No, I mean,
everything under the sun.
it's been great to talk at such a fascinating time. I mean, there are so many big uncertainties in the world, right? And the one we haven't talked about is AI, where actually I happen to think that the US and China have a great deal in common, because the risk for both of them is the kind of deep fakes we're now seeing on AI could precipitate the kind of war that none of us want to see. So I actually think regulation of AI it may be easier to get agreement from China than we think.
Yeah, I was going to ask. I assume that you saw that joint letter written by a number of prominent people who have developed AI or work in that sphere, really warning of the existential threat to AI. I know one signatory said that he felt like this was a possibility for cooperation between China and the United States. Do you feel that AI is a major threat?
Well, I mean, our prime minister is meeting Biden. He's in Washington at the moment, and he is going to, I mean, he wants to get agreement from President Biden that London can lead on an AI regulation task force. And part of the idea of that would be certainly to invite China to some of those stages, because this has to be, it has to be a global threat with a global solution. And if you look at what Sam Altman, the sort of some of the OpenAI ChatGPT people have said, as you said, in the last few weeks, I mean, when the people who've invented the stuff are begging governments to regulate it, a big response is needed.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
I'll just tell one anecdote, or it's a true story. Maybe you've heard of it. You probably have heard this, but maybe the audience has not. But apparently, the U.S. did had a drone and a kind of pretend command center. Well, the command center was actually supposedly, pretend person in the command center, and the drone's mission was to attack some target. And someone in this robot in the command center was doing things to get it not to work, frustrating the drone. So the drone figured out that the way to complete its mission, to get highest payoff in terms of its, it gets pluses for achieving its goal in terms of the computer algorithm. Getting the maximum reward involved shooting up the command center and then going to attack the target, and that's apparently exactly what happened.
Right.
Yeah, so maybe it's not taking over the world anytime soon. And maybe we're all safe.
Maybe we're all safe. That's a possibility. Well, I want to thank you so much for giving your time to us and talking about all these different issues. I know that there's so many to talk about, and hopefully we can maybe sometime talk about more of them.
Right. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So much.
It was great. Thanks so much for coming on.
All the best.
All right.
Bye.
Okay.